Pow.
This is Robert Hunter. You're watching the Break It Down Show.
Robert shaved. I did not, and that's how we get fancy around here. But he's also fancier than me, so I appreciate you coming on. He and I met at a conference where we talked about. This is really relevant because here's the book right here. We talked about the birthday of NATO, and he was a speaker at a thing where I had written something, and we became friends because we talked about NATO and challenges, and it's been great to have you on over the show.
Did you actually read it, or are you just showing the book?
I'm in the book.
Good. You're the only one.
You know, one of the things that I love about our connection there, so by writing something, I got to go speak about something, and I got to meet you, and someone who's at the ambassador level or the advisor to the president level got to talk to someone who goes out into villages and hamlets that don't even have electricity, don't even have roads, right? And the two of us, we don't really ever talk. I don't know another ambassador. I know a senator, sort of, right? But the people who set policy, the people who decide the theory and choose these things and try to help manage the US's relationship with another country, we don't often have enough people like me in their confidence because we're all just too busy, right? The system doesn't kind of tolerate that kind of thing. And it's one of the things I like, that we get a chance to have these conversations about a complex place like Ukraine and its war with Russia. And so I appreciate you coming on the show. What are your thoughts in terms of the ground truth? And look, we'll be nice and say a checkered past in these recent wars in getting things right once the fighting stops.
Well, you're going to have to break down what your question about the ground truth. I think it is true that it's important to have some kind of interaction with the people actually doing the business. I don't anymore. They don't even listen to me anymore, though I continue to do my writing and speaking and all that. And I often wonder whether this government or other government gets the people it really needs in order to be able to do an effective job in different parts of the world. One, it's a great big place. There's a lot to be done.
Yeah.
Secondly, presidents have to be willing to hire people who really know what they're doing. And it's not just who they're comfortable with, but who are prepared to stand up and say, in a nice way, of course, because you don't want to have your head chopped off, Mr. President, you're wrong.
Boy.
I have seen a few advisors to presidents being willing to say that, but that depends more on the president than on the advisor. Most presidents don't want to be told that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of presidents, and I have to say the last two are in this category, haven't really wanted to have people around who are going to tell them what they had to do and get it right.
I would add another element of that too, as the guy who would come in and have to sometimes shoot straight, is even if the boss wants to hear it, the guys around that table don't want to. And so if I shoot straight at Secretary Austin, he's not going to like it. And that's dangerous, right? When when the staff says one thing and you're like, oh, hold on, that is not true, at least not where I was. That creates problems, right? And
absolutely,
yeah, it's not good for so the boss wants to know when there's problems so that he can deal or she can deal with the problems and provision things. But when you bring problems all the time, that makes you unpopular with a lot of people.
Well, the system is supposed to be set up, and in at least 3 national security advisors and 4 administrations, it did work like that. When you had Ford and George Bush the senior with Henry Kissinger was around, and when you had Brent Scowcroft and Big Brzezinski, they themselves wanted to get, quote, the truth from their staff, or at least different views if it comes to that. Right. And then the presidents in question wanted to be told what was going on. Let me get rid of the robocall. There you go. I don't want to buy health insurance. Thank you.
How about an extension on your car loan or your insurance?
And so presidents have to be willing to do that.
Right.
But the system has to. I had a rule, which is if a problem is not a, well, there was the famous sign on the Harry Truman's presidential desk, the buck stops here. And it got resurrected in a later presidency. But I used to say in the 3 presidents I worked for that on the back of it in small print it says, and if it is not a presidential quality, the decision better not get here. It should be decided at a lower level. We pay the president to make the tough choices.
Right.
That's what he or she runs for. At least they have to recognize that, to make the tough choices.
Right.
And that means people who are going to tee up the alternatives, the background, so the president can make the tough choices. And sometimes we've had presidents and their staff willing to do that. As we go along, your viewers are going to get to know that I'm a Democrat, all right? But the last 2 presidents, in my judgment, who were best at getting decisions made some mistakes, but who was best at it, you would never guess, because I'm a Democrat, they were Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush.
Yeah.
Because they knew that they had to get it right, and they were willing to hire people who tell them what they had to do. Later presidents, I'm afraid, haven't, in general, been up to that standard.
One of the things, and this is just me talking, I'm asking you because I want you to tell me what you think, but it seems like when our policy people come out of the schools, they tend to lean towards the Democrat side. That's just sort of how that process works. And when they come out, they have that mindset. And when we think about the policies and the approaches to fixing things through State Department, through DOD as a tool, they tend to look at things like, we love co-ops. I'm saying that because I've seen the passion for co-ops through the State Department. And when these things,
what are co-ops?
Cooperative farming thing. So we'll go out and teach the Iraqis how to farm. We'll go and we'll say, hey, what these Afghans need is a tractor that they're all going to share, right? And we will lie to ourselves and tell us it's working. But Pete is there every day. And so he'll go out to the co-op before, during, and after the whole thing. And when the State Department shows up, and I'm being unfair to the State Department, but they can take it. When they get the performative lunch and everybody's like, this is the greatest thing ever. You get, here, let me show you a picture. You get these pictures where they're like, this is, and if you type in Green Medine, you get these wonderful images. Fred and the farmer, boy, they've really connected. And it's all bullshit, right? And so when Pete is there the day before, the week after, 5 weeks after, no one ever goes there. When no one is in that building, when no one else is there, but State Department cannot stand the fact that it doesn't work. They hate it, right? Because co-ops always work because of how they solve problems. I'm not saying that Republicans solve problems better. They would have their own failings, but in the case of Ukraine, we have billionaire industrialists that know how to turn dirt into titanium and various titanium products. We hate that. We hate that in terms of solving problems. How do we deal with this flaw in our approach to policy?
Well, let me unpack a little bit of what you
Please.
said. You just had about a year's worth of educating me to learn about it. In terms of politics, most State Department people tend to be bipartisan or nonpartisan.
Okay.
Most Defense Department people, if you scratched them, would probably be Republicans. Most military are. Most people coming out of the think tank community tend to be Democrats. But one thing that I learned, having served, particularly in the Carter White House, when I was the lead person for Europe for 2 years, and then the lead person for the Middle East for 2 years, where we had a tiny staff. Kissinger, Brzezinski, and Scowcroft had tiny staffs, so you had to give a broad perspective. We had a total of 60 professionals in each of these, dealing with the whole world, which means you have to pay attention to a lot of people. Now they have about 600. So everybody's got a tiny, tiny little piece, but you don't have people who look at it together. But the thing I discovered, and this should be so obvious, but I'm going to say it to you anyway, and you're going to say, oh God, why did everybody need this lesson? Is the world doesn't give a damn what political party is in charge. Various countries have their own interests. They
Right.
see the United States as this great lump, which is doing things. It's going to react to what the United States does, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat or in office. I create a bunch of rules. One of my rules was they're all whimsical. New team comes in, opposite party. Or even when George H.W. Bush took over from Reagan, he changed everybody, okay? I won't go into why. I guess it was because Bush was more serious about foreign policy. But they come in and they say, the last team, they got it all wrong. Give me 6 months and I'll change everything. 6 months later, they say, those people weren't so stupid. Because whatever your approach to foreign policy is, there's only one that works, and that's realism.
Yeah.
What's really going on? Not whether you have this idea, you want this to happen. Now, in America, we do have this combination that has to be there. One is, let's call it realpolitik. The other is called what we call values. Because among other things, you've got to sell your foreign policy to the American people. So we put in a lot more human rights than some countries do, particularly some of the larger countries. But you got to blend the two, and you got to make the whole work. But you got to, I'm sorry, the default position for every president has to be the reality you are dealing with. You start with that. Now, I also had another rule. I don't want to bore everybody with it. Some people would come in and say, okay, human rights, to hell with it. Throw it overboard. I said, no, wait a second. Maybe at the end of the day, you're going to have to sacrifice a value, human rights, for realpolitik, but you only do it at the end when you absolutely have to. You keep it in the mix. It's part of being American. It's part of being able to sell a policy. It's part of dealing with, particularly in Western Europe, which many of those countries have a greater value-based foreign policy than we do, partly because they don't have to exercise a lot of power. You'll find that, for example, in the Scandinavian countries and the Benelux and that sort of thing.
Right.
As opposed to the British and the French, who are really very hard-nosed about foreign affairs and always have been and always will be. More like we are.
So let me go back a little bit to my long thing that we talked about. When we do pick the wrong policies and then go back to the next country and pick it again and pick it again. Look, let me say this in a different way. Yeah, earlier this week, maybe it was last week, Secretary Clinton, it's like, hey, we've got our Reconstruction for Ukraine project launched now.
Secretary Clinton?
Yeah. And
there's no Secretary Clinton right now.
Well, no, but I'm giving her the title that she, reached. So yes.
Oh, okay.
Hillary Clinton.
You mean what she's saying is somebody outside of government? Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So I'm just giving her that. She's been that title. So I'm giving her. Yeah. I don't know that she's earned the right to do that again. I mean, it's at some point we have to find a different approach. And this is not because she's.
What has she been saying that I'm responding to?
Well, she's got launching this initiative to reconstruct and be part of the stabilization of Ukraine post-war. And my question is how many times do we get to try this again? We've seen so much of this failure in the last 20 years. She's part of that record. President Biden's part of that. The whole crew right now inside the White House is part of that. It's a lot of failure on these people's resumes. Why are we? Do they deserve the benefit of the doubt again and again and again? Or at some point, do we just say, you guys got to slide aside and let's try something else? I mean, what lessons have we learned?
Well, first place, everybody has a right to express an opinion.
Sure,
and,
yeah.
Even a stopped clock is right twice a day, as they say, right? And you want to listen to lots of people. And among other things, if I'm speaking to a broad audience here, is be careful what media you pay attention to. Pay attention to the Break It Down show. But if you're going to read the Washington Post and the New York Times and that's it, you're probably going to get it wrong. If you're
That's
going
true.
to watch the news media, whether it's the big three of CNN and Fox and MSNBC, you can watch all three, and they're still probably going to get it wrong. You can read the Financial Times, you can watch the BBC, you can watch French 24. If you want to be informed, you got to look at a lot of stuff and then think for yourself.
Yeah.
Think for yourself. And many think tanks. We have a habit in this country, and I've been part of this. You know, I've been part of the establishment a long time, and
Sure.
I've made my share of mistakes. I was for the Vietnam War a lot longer than my brain should have told me not to be for it. And of
Right.
course, somebody was for it. One candidate, you remember, what was his name? John Kerry got in trouble when he ran for president. He said, I was for the Iraq War until I was against it. Well, politically, that wasn't very smart. But it became a consensus. You needed to be for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the people who said the opposite couldn't get a hearing. And even though we now know it was wrong,
Right.
some people who were right, and I'm one of them, I just happen to be, I was wrong in a lot of other stuff, I happen to get that one right, are still blacklisted.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
Still blacklisted. Because there's a group of people in the media who will say, whether I get it right or wrong, I got the right to be in charge here. Got to be very careful. Got to be very careful. And think for yourself. And don't even listen to me. So I said to a group I spoke to in Germany last week, I gave them the straight poop. And I said, now, if you go out of here and you agree 100% with what I just said, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You're in trouble.
Yeah.
Even I'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
If I don't learn something on this show, I'm going to be in trouble because you got to constantly think about it. Now, the problem is we tend to look for consensus. And right now we have a consensus around a certain number of things. And for example, we have a confrontation with China and we might have a war with China. Huh? Please, let's think that thing through a little more carefully.
Yeah.
We have a confrontation with Iran. If we're not careful, Iran's going to get the bomb. Huh? We had a chance in 2015 of getting rid of all they were doing. And then Trump comes along and he threw it out because he didn't like what Obama had done. Biden came in, he had a chance to go back to what we wanted, what was working, and he still hadn't done it because of, I really don't want to get domestic politics. Won't let him do it. There's some folks out there who want to have a confrontation with Iran. They're perfectly happy to have a war with Iran, which we'll pay for in blood and treasure. Whereas we could, by just going back to what Obama negotiated in 2015, just pick that up again and go forward with it. And we can worry about small stuff with Iran later on. Okay, so we got a consensus right now, and now getting to where we're talking about. Prevailing consensus right now is there's a new Cold War with Russia. That what Putin is doing, he did it all by his little lonesome. He decided he wanted to put together the old Russian Empire. He believes that Ukraine has no right to exist and never had a right to exist independently. Maybe he does believe that. I don't know. But I know what he says. I read what he says. I've read what he says over the years. I watch what he does. But also his successors have to figure out, how do we live in the outside world?
Right.
And we have to say, whether we like it or not, we are going to have to live with Russia. It's going to be one of the three great powers in the world. The United States, which will most likely continue to be number one. We tend to poor mouth ourselves. And poor mouth democracy. Come on, our democracy, despite what so many of the naysayers say, is extremely strong.
Yeah.
If you turned off your television and you went out into your community, you would find democracy is a lot stronger than you're told it is, and try to get people to make you believe it is. That's media is doing us a terrible disservice on that.
Yeah.
The other one, of course, is China. because of the growth of its economy, etc. Whether that's going to be a strategic challenge to us, maybe yes, maybe not. One of the difference between China, let's say, and Russia is we have no land frontier with China that we care about. There is the 38th parallel, more or less, in Korea.
Yep.
There's some bits in Southeast Asia, some bits and pieces. There are these funny little islands they put together. And there is a stupidity of China trying to take back Taiwan, and we're talking about maybe a war with Taiwan. And all these American diplomats and political people run out to Taiwan, fanning the flames, which is just idiocy. Nixon worked out a good framework. Clinton followed it up. It can work. But the fact is, in Europe, we have a land frontier.
Yeah.
With Russia.
Yeah.
Ships can sail away. Tanks can't sail away in the same way. So we got to deal with that. Okay. Now I'm going to take you back to 2000. No, 1989. Okay. You got to learn from history. If you're going to be in this business, if you're going to deal with any country, if you really want to be serious about it, you can. I don't talk about China because I don't know enough about Chinese history. So I keep away from it. But I do know a lot about European history, Russian history, Middle East history, Arab, Israeli, Iran, and I've also worked on them professionally at the highest levels of the US government. So I can at least have a slightly informed opinion, whereas I leave China alone. I try to find people, I haven't found them yet, who can really tell me what I need to know, but I will eventually. 1989, the Cold War is coming to an end. The Russian Empire lost. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, both the internal empire, Soviet Union, and the external empire in Central and Eastern Europe, they both collapsed in the period between the 9th of November 1989, opening of the Berlin Wall, and Christmas night, our Christmas, not their Christmas, in 1991, where the Soviet Union physically went out of existence. There was a NATO meeting approximately at that time when they were having what they call the family photo, and all the leaders were there, and the Russian Soviet guy happened to be there, and they had all the flags. A hand reached through the curtain, removed the Soviet flag, and replaced it with the Russian flag. Went out of business. It was, in fact, the most profound collapse of any empire without war in all of human history. Okay, so then what do? You've got all of Central Europe is suddenly independent. You've got the Soviet Union, instead of being one country, is now 15. Okay, and they're all running off on their own. What do you do about it? Well, George H.W. Bush was very smart. And he gave a speech and he said, what we want to do is build here it comes, sometimes grand strategy can be expressed in a very few words. We want to build a Europe whole and free. And then they added, and at peace to it. Whole and free. That meant whole, everybody involved, free, everybody free. And he began the process, and we picked it up under the Clinton administration, where I had the honor probably to play as much a role as anybody under Clinton, because I had the good fortune to be ambassador to NATO, where the work was done with all the people in Washington, but we had a major leading role, and it was bipartisan. One thing about NATO is maybe almost uniquely in American foreign policy, it's always bipartisan. Always bipartisan. There's a little tinkering here and a little tinkering there. People say that Trump is anti-NATO. I could make a good case that that's rubbish, but we don't have time to do that. But I get hollered down by my Democratic colleagues who needed in 2016 to explain a reason why Hillary lost. Hillary was a bad candidate. Okay? And so the Russians interfered in part with interfered in our politics. But to say that the Russians caused the 3 swing states to go for Trump or that the Russian interference made a difference, I mean, that's cockamamie. That makes the American people look absolutely stupid. Hillary got it. She said, fair and square, I lost. But a lot of her people didn't. They said, oh, no, we can't accept that. Oh, it must have been the Russians. And it must have been Trump in bed with the Russians. That's what the first impeachment was about, which started even before he became president. And then when Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor, came along and said, there's no case here, they said, oh, that's the wrong answer. But there's got to be the right answer. So then they say, oh, it must be Ukraine. And here's what's been going with Trump and Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. And that's where the first impeachment came. That was nonsense. But the impeachment was not about things that Trump had done that they could prove or really happened. It was, how do we get rid of Trump?
Right.
And it's the best mechanism. Okay. The second impeachment was more realistic. At that point, the guy was going to be out of office in 14 days anyway. That was a waste of time. And Trump has enjoyed it ever since. All these prosecutions of Trump, it's Brer Rabbit and the Briar Patch. He loves it. Not just with his base, but a lot of other Americans say classified documents in his closet in Mar-a-Lago. What were they about anyway? And don't other presidents take classified documents home? And we've had other people get in trouble. Ted Sorensen, who was a speechwriter for Kennedy, took a bunch of top secret documents home in order to write his biography of Kennedy. He got caught at it, and they denied him becoming head of the CIA, but he didn't go to prison. When come on, give me a break. But the media is going to give us Trump again.
Yeah, they sure are.
Come on, a little deal.
So,
okay. So
yeah.
Let's go back. So
Okay.
What do they say? Okay. We looked at two things, beginning with Bush and then with Clinton. We looked at a little history. 1919 at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles. In order to get reparations against Germany, which the French wanted and the British wanted, it was necessary to have a legal basis for that. So they wrote into the treaty. You can read it. It's Article 231, the War Clause. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for World War I, which of course is nonsense. They signed on to it. Well, Hitler rode to town on that. All right, he used that over and over again as part of the case about Germany being done down. Well, Bush was smart enough, and Clinton and his team were smart enough to say, hey, we can't make that mistake again. Russia lost the Cold War, but don't punish them for it. Don't create revenge. Don't get the Russian people to feel that they were screwed. Don't diss them. Treat them like they were real boys. George Bush was very good at that. So was Clinton. They didn't punish them. They treated them like they were real and that they were going to have a future. So that was point one. Point two, I've already said, is that Russia is going to be a great power again.
Yeah.
At the time, we used to joke it was Guatemala with nuclear weapons, but at some point, it's going to be a big power again. It's already become enough of a serious military power to do what it's done in Ukraine. Obviously, it fell far short of what Putin would like to be able to do, but it's not nothing.
No.
At some point in the future, we're going to have to deal with them. Do you want to deal with them? People feeling total revenge? And trust me, the war in Ukraine, whatever you get told, is largely popular with the Russian people because they know what was done to them after Clinton, mid-Clinton, and later on, in which a lot of things were done to push the Russians away. We brought them together at the beginning of the 2000s. Let me give one of the most important things to show that Russia we were going to reach out to them and be good to them. We got them in Partnership for Peace, and there was a NATO-Russia Founding Act. Look it up. May the 17th, 1997, signed at the Élysée Palace, 19 areas of cooperation, whole bunch of principles. It's an amazing document, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. To balance that, we came up with a NATO-Ukraine Charter because we knew that Ukraine could not be allowed to be in the Russian sphere of influence, but it also couldn't be put into NATO, where it would be a constant telling of Russia, you don't count. That is a threat to Russia. I've got a dog now, too.
Yeah.
So that was the NATO-Ukraine Charter, which I negotiated with the Ukrainians, all right?
Yeah.
Okay. And still extend. In fact, what they did at the Vilnius summit, they came up with a new arrangement with the Ukrainians. It's the same thing we did in 1997. Same thing, a few different words. Okay. So let me give you one of the big things that happened. The Bosnia War finally came to an end in 1995. The Russians supported us in what NATO did with its military power to stop the war. They weren't involved, but there was a United Nations Security Council resolution which the Russians agreed to, as did the Chinese, along with the British, French, and the United States. War comes to an end. So we put in a thing called the implementation force. Is this too much noise?
No, I think it's great. It's like real life, like when you have to do
Just
work.
agree with me,
Yeah, it's
Come on, Rusty, stop it. And I'm going to throw in something. Do I have something to throw in just a second? Okay, here we go.
This is how life works, right? You have
A treat.
coffee in a piazza, and people drive by, and dogs go. And,
So we get there,
yeah.
and there is this implementation force that went into Bosnia. And
I was there.
you were there, okay? Since the war ended, at about the 2nd of September 1995 to today, there has not been one combat fatality. Not one. It's held. After 200,000 people died in that war, since it stopped, not one casualty. It's worked.
Remarkable. Okay. Yeah.
So we put this thing together, which was going to be NATO-led. The Russians came to us and said, we'd like to belong to it. And when I was NATO ambassador, it was a meeting in my office. We had Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense. We had Grachev, the Russian Minister of Defense. And the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, heading all NATO troops, American general as always, who was George Dowan. And Grachev said, I want to be part of this thing called I4. I want to send my great troops. I remember what happened on the Elbe in 1945, where it was just us and you, the defeated Germany. Being part of I4 will show my people we are still taken seriously as a big boy by the United States, which is a lot of what it's about, which we've been doing on all these things. But, he said, I got a problem. I can't put my people under the command of NATO. Oh, come on, I can't possibly do that. So Jalman got out a chart, big chart, military level charts, and the charts drew like this. He says, here is the NATO command going down to the I4 command, which could go to Russia. Okay. Here is the US European command, it's totally American, which would go down to I4 and could go to Russia. He said, now what I suggest, instead of NATO commanding Russian troops in I4, it'd be the US commander commanding the Russian troops in I4. Grachev said, of course I can do that. That puts me in the big game. It's not NATO, it's the US commander. That's fine. The great trick was, it was the same man.
Yeah.
SACEUR was George Jalwan, NATO. The US European Command was George Jalwan, American. So the Russians said, as long as not. And so what did they do? They sent their very best troops.
Yeah.
Very best. And they did a tremendous job. There were a couple of occasions where our people got in trouble, and the Russians came along and rescued them.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the Russian troops. And it worked. Well, till about 1998, and then the teams change.
Can I add a little context to your story? Give you a little bit because you'll like this. So two things. One is directly from my unit because we were a company of spies and interrogators, and we had a Russian defector that had belonged to our unit, and so the Russians were desperate to
Defecting
get
from what?
what's that?
What was he defecting from?
He had defected from Soviet Russia, and so he belonged to us, and the Russians wanted him back. And one of our commanders in the American chain was kind of arrogant. And he's like, that guy's going to go right over there by the Russians. And we're like, you cannot do that because we don't have a rule of engagement that will allow us to protect this guy. And they're like, we're not going to take him from us. We're like, we stopped. And so we ultimately, it was so contentious between the Russians. And this is more like capture the flag. This is not like.
What year was this?
This is 96.
Okay.
And so ultimately what we had to do was we had to send our Russian home to America because it was untenable because there was at that level, at the ground truth level, there was enough contention there. And the commanders were, jockeying for like, who's like the tougher guy. And again, it's capture the flag. But if we had lost control of that guy, now all of a sudden you're involved, because like, how do we get this American back who, So there's that, and I don't know if you'd ever heard that story. And then Philip Ingram, who's
story.
Yeah, it's great.
I was at NATO, and you never picked up the phone and said, "Robert, I want you to know something."
Yeah, I didn't know the story. You have to hear from Eric Kleinsmith, who was my commander, and then there's another one from Philip Ingram, who's he's a British guy. He was saying, "Hey, one of the things is that the Russians wanted to show off their intel capacity. So as we were all rolling into position." From his telling, the Russians rolled in ahead of us in the order of battle because they had collected on when we were going to arrive, and they wanted to be the big dogs, so they showed up early. Like, haha! Yeah. And so that was part of their establishing their like their dominance in the area in terms of how we all saw it on the ground. And just one of those funny things when you let units all play in the same space, we're still competing. And it's like the Russians like, yeah, we have intel sources and we know when you're going to arrive. We know when you think we're going to arrive, and we're going to arrive 2 days early. And so they did a little bit of just, again, it's just gamesmanship, but these things are all part of the great game.
That's why you talk to one another.
Yeah.
People may not know that in Syria today, the United States Air Force operates. Okay, the Russian Air Force operates today. How do they keep from running into one another? They talk to one another.
Yeah,
it's called forced deconfliction. The American commander calls the Russian commander and say, "I'm about to do this," and he says, "I got you. I'm about to do that. I'll keep out of your way."
Yeah.
Now, if you want to have a war, you ignore it, but if you don't have a war, that's what you do. Now, I got to get on to what happened because,
please.
Bottom line, there's no excuse for what Putin did. Okay, but beginning about 1998, the people in the United States who understood those two principles, don't repeat the Treaty of Versailles, you're going to have to deal with Russia in the future, left the government. Okay, and they started doing things. For example, they went into Kosovo without a UN Security Council resolution, okay, which was the intervention in a sovereign country by NATO. Okay? Or maybe we had to do it. We abrogated the ABM Treaty of 1972. Who needed it anymore? The problem was the ABM Treaty was one of the few things that the Russians could say, we're in the big leagues. Then we put ballistic missile defenses in Central Europe in Russia's backyard. Why did we do that against Russia? No, of course not. They were too puny, and the Russians knew it, but it was in their backyard. Why did we put them in there? Because we were worried about, listen for it, North Korea and Iran. Missile defenses in Europe against North Korea and against Iran that doesn't either have the bomb or the missiles. That was nuts.
Right.
We also quit the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. The Russians quit the forces in the conventional forces in Europe treaty. Russia did a lot of bad things too. We're both doing some things that were bad, but the real problem came up in 2008. This is the one that really was the bad thing, when things were getting bad then anyway, but still like salvageable. There were some people in the George W. Bush administration who had decided, Russia of no account, why don't we bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO? Well, everybody with a brain understood that that would be used, even though we're Pacific, we're not going to cause any threats, but that's going to get used by the people in Russia who don't want to work with the West as an excuse to say we're being surrounded. You got to remember, countries tend to overreact. We overreacted in 1961 when Castro said, I'm a communist. So we ran the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
Minor stuff. In Grenada, people don't remember that, a tiny little island in the Caribbean, when a communist took over, we invaded Grenada. I mean,
We did.
It's going to attack Miami? Give me a break, okay? Countries do that, okay? So in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, the Bush administration wanted to take Ukraine and Georgia one step short of NATO membership. And the other allies said, are you nuts? Give a commitment to these countries to go to war for them? That's what NATO membership means, the so-called Article 5. It's a pledge to go to war. People can say, I'm not going to do that for Georgia. For Georgia, where the hell is Georgia? We don't have Sherman to go to war against Georgia. You know, where's Georgia? All right, I know where Georgia. I've been there a lot of times. So the Allies, particularly German friends, said you're nuts. So they worked out a compromise, and it was one of these. It said, and look it up. It's in the Declaration. Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, by which they meant way off sometime. But for most of the Allies, that meant never. Diplomats speak for never. All right. I was across the street at another meeting, and I barked and I said, don't they know what they just said? To say they will become members of NATO. That is the moment of commitment. It's what the words mean. Well, two people believed it that way. More Christians to the lions there. The president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, very strange man, who's now in a mental hospital back in Georgia. He decided that was a chance to go back into a breakaway province of Georgia called South Ossetia and take it back. And so he sent troops into South Ossetia to take it back, even though the Assistant Secretary of State, who's told me twice, was on the telephone saying, for God's sakes, don't do that. Nobody's going to back you up. He said, oh, I got this commitment out of the NATO people. We will become members of NATO. So he took it back, went in. The Russians counteracted 5 days later, handed the Georgians their head. Now, most people now say, because that's the way propaganda works, the Russians invaded Georgia. They did invade Georgia in response to the Georgian invasion. And the interesting thing was, we gave Georgia a few arms, but not a single NATO ally came to Georgia's defense. Not one.
Right.
And that meant the commitment was worthless.
Yeah.
I said at the time, I said, oh, we do something stupid about Ukraine. Well, instead of dropping that commitment, NATO has said it over and over and over again, including by the US Secretary of State on the 26th of January, 2022, repeated it 3 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Maybe he would have done it anyway. All right, now another time, 2014. Meanwhile, there is an election in Georgia, and the pro-Russian guy wins, all right? Unacceptable. So there's rioting in the streets, and one could understand that, because there was going to be I'm sorry how complicated it gets, but you got to understand your history.
Yeah, I'm learning.
In European Union agreement with Ukraine, this pro-Russian guy comes in and he scraps it. So people went into the Maidan, which is this great central plaza in Kyiv, and a number of people got killed. You can go there and see the memorial. An assistant secretary of state gets on an open line to the American ambassador to Kyiv and says, let's put our guy in power, right? That's called a coup d'etat.
Yeah.
Now, am I just making it up? No, it's on the
No.
internet. The Russians intercepted the phone call, probably the Russians, and put it on the internet.
Yeah.
And you can both hear it and you can read it. You say to yourself, we spent all this money on secure telephone communications. Why didn't we use that?
Yeah.
Well, 3 weeks later, Putin goes into Crimea and the Donbass. Now, he maybe would have done it anyway, but it was a marvelous excuse. Incidentally, most people know, though Russia broke all its commitments by going into Crimea. It broke the Helsinki Final Act. It broke the 2004 commitment, United States, Britain, and who was the third? Russia, so that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. China and France did it in exchange for an absolute guarantee that nobody would attack Ukraine. Also happened with Belarus and Kazakhstan. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, okay? So by going into Ukraine and the Donbass, Putin broke that commitment, all right? There's no question about that, the violation of the commitment. Well, of course, Crimea was only accidentally in Ukraine. During the Soviet Union, it was part of the Russian
That's right.
socialist republics and all that kind of stuff until 1951 for a variety of reasons. Khrushchev was in power, he was a Ukrainian, but there were also some internal reasons.
Right.
They transferred Ukraine from the Russian SSR to a thing they called the Ukrainian SSR, okay, which existed. Soviet Union collapses, and suddenly Crimea finds itself in Ukraine, quite by accident.
Yeah.
Even though it is almost entirely Russian speakers. And the Ukrainians, instead of doing the smart thing, said, you're part of Ukraine now. No Russian speaking, no Russian education, no autonomy. You got to just speak Ukrainian. We're not going to give you any way to have any autonomy, which was stupid. Okay? They could have bought a lot of things by saying, you want to speak Russian as well as Ukrainian, and so what? Be my guest. But we will give you some autonomy like is done elsewhere, like is done in Belgium.
Yeah.
Belgium has 5 levels of government because they've got 2 languages and 2 peoples there. So they have 5 levels of government. So,
I mean, that region is called the Benelux for a reason, right? It's a bit of a soup over there. Well, you have to kind of combine things,
Belgium itself is a soup, but that's right. They make it work, just like Canada makes it work, right?
Yeah. I want to ask you this. I don't want to run out of time, if you don't mind, unless you want to finish.
Well, let me just finish the point. So we have a situation that nothing justifies what Putin's doing.
Right.
But we have to find a way to move this war to a point where both sides will be willing to negotiate, and the grounds for negotiation are pretty clear, and I can go into them if you want. They're pretty clear. It doesn't require a slide rule and some bright Einstein to figure out. It could be done if both sides were willing to negotiate. But right now, neither side is.
Yeah, right. And you want to think that they're running out of people, but there's a lot on the line, and so they'll find more people, right? Because they're not, there's a lot on the line. One of the things I'm wondering when you put your ambassador hat on or your secretary of state hat on is as we know, a lot of the infrastructure is tied together. No matter what we do, we need a Russia that's strong enough to control its assets and borders. The last thing we want is, somebody further weakening Russia and getting a hold of nuclear weapons. We need Russia to be stable enough. Also, we have all of these industries that help to stabilize Eurasia. And we love to denigrate people who are successful in business as oligarchs, but a lot of these people are good at business and complex businesses that we need. So when you're looking at how do you repair, these guys all grew up together. All of these people who are billionaires and multimillionaires and do business together. It's like when Zelensky's like, these guys are all corrupt, except for the arms dealer. I got to have that guy because he knows all the Russians who have all the arms that we need. So we're always trying to figure this out. How do we deal with the fact that these guys all came up in the same system? They all figured out how to make money in the same system. They're going to have to work together, and we can remove these people who are experts. But we did that in Iraq, and we got people. We took all the people that graduated from the London School of Economics and other great places. We're like, get out of here,
I did.
persona non grata, right? Yeah. How do we manage the economic? Because Ukraine has plenty of industry, right, to succeed. And if we get out of their way, they're going to be all right. The corruption part, I don't know if we fix that. I don't know if it matters. But we're desperate. We're desperate to not get this right, I think, as Americans.
You started this by talking about reconstruction.
Yeah.
Ukraine is going to have to go through an amazing amount of reconstruction when the war ends. They can't do it on their own. They have suffered terribly. I sometimes refer to this, let's go back in history, like it's the second battle of the Somme, which was in the spring of 1916. 6,000 people died, all right?
Right.
But it was in France, and all the civilians who got killed were French. In this particular war, all the civilians are getting killed are Ukrainian.
Yeah.
There's going to have to be massive reconstruction. The Ukrainians are very talented people. And given half a chance, once the war stops, they're going to be able to do it. Right now, there's really one person who has to be persuaded, and that is Vladimir Putin. He is the bad guy.
Yeah.
Now, let me tell you one good thing that Biden did from the beginning. He said, we can't have a war directly with Russia. American people don't want it.
Right.
It's not worth it. Can't have another war. Can't have a war with Russia. That'd be stupid. So what Biden has done since the beginning is he limited the supply of weapons to Ukraine just enough to defend itself and get back some of its territory, but not enough to take the war into Russia, number one.
Right.
Number two, people are going to find it hard to believe what I'm about to say. There is now a tacit agreement between Bush and Putin, the United States and Russia, that Russia will not attack a NATO ally, which has a NATO strategic commitment, and we will not let Ukraine take the war into Russia proper, other than a little bit here and there.
Yeah.
Now the Ukrainians, for their part, and I might do it for Ukraine, all these drone attacks in Moscow and all that stuff, trying to provoke Russia attacking a NATO ally in order to widen the war. But Biden is saying, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
I don't want a war with Russia. We don't want, the American people don't want another war. They don't want one of the war.
We don't want the war we're already getting. Yeah.
But the question is, are people thinking in our government, thinking forward, how do we do the long term of dealing with this pariah state with all of its war crimes?
Right.
Putin is a war criminal, no question about that. How can you have to wait until he's gone? How long will he be? We can't get rid of him. How do we stabilize things there or see it stabilized? Get on with the business of saving, helping to save the people of Ukraine who deserve it, who've been amazingly courageous. But the tactical situation, which I think Biden is handling quite well, needs to be fed into the strategic situation in the future. And I don't know if that's being thought about. But there's one guy who's got to change his mind, and that's Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
How to do that, I haven't a clue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most obvious way is that his heart stops beating for a variety of reasons, right? Because it's just, if he because he is a war criminal, he's got to believe that he's not going to be held to account. And I don't know how.
Any replacement for Putin
Yeah.
is still going to have Russian interests at heart.
Yep.
Maybe cut a deal. It's going to have Russian interests at heart.
That's right.
Of just lying down and rolling over the way a lot of Americans late Clinton until now believe it can be done. It isn't going to happen. No, I think that'd be the great thing if Putin would suddenly decide to take the Kerensky chair at the University of at Stanford, which Kerensky, who was the Russian leader before the Soviets came in, went to the Hoover Institution. Probably didn't know that. So there's probably a chair there for Putin if he wants it. Or
he could also take the Prigozhin chair and hop onto a Learjet.
Pardon?
He could take the Prigozhin chair and hop onto a Learjet and find himself in a flat spin. You know, I mean, it's very dangerous to be Putin right now. Very, very dangerous. And I'm not advocating the harm of anybody. I'm just saying that he is living a dangerous life, and his dossier is on a lot of people's desks.
But in the West, we have to continue to show sufficient support for the Ukrainian military effort, which is getting weaker by the day.
Yeah.
Certain Slovak wins, he'll stop support. The Poles, who are always like Poles, have said we're not going to help Ukraine anymore because they're sending their wheat transshipment through Poland, which because the Russians have blockaded some. But instead of just transshipping it, they are using Ukrainian grain, wheat, to displace Polish wheat in the Polish market. You've got Orban of Hungary not being helpful. So it's kind of weak. But we've got to show Putin, now that the fighting season's almost coming to an end, that he won't in the spring, God forbid, all the number of Ukrainians are going to die.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Yeah. He's got to understand he cannot prevail, and he better grab a solution while it's available. And I will share with you my PowerPoint on this about what the solution is. It includes ceasefire. It includes Russian withdrawing troops. It requires Ukrainian sovereignty over all of Ukraine. It requires autonomy for the Russian-speaking areas. In fact, there's a formula that's called Minsk II, which was not followed by either Ukraine or Russia that we're not part of. The Institute Minsk II, add to it. I mean, a smart negotiator could figure this out in 20 minutes. If Putin were to say, I'm prepared to do it, and then Zelensky would do it. And I'll say one final thing on it. The negotiation is going to be done by the United States and Russia.
Right.
I
agree with you there.
The big boys. The only person who Russia will accept as an interlocutor is the United States.
The
only person the Western allies will accept is the United States.
Right.
And
Has to be.
And we can't walk away from Russia, from Ukraine. We're stuck there until this is resolved, and that may be many years from now. The idea of disengaging from Ukraine, that's whistling in the wind.
No, I agree. And Zelensky is as great as he's been in his role as this, his role is limited, right? When you have to go to another country's Congress to go ask for help, the people that give you that help are the ones that are going to negotiate the end of this thing. And you get to be part of it, but you're not going to be at the big table with the big decision.
If I was Zelensky, I'd do exactly what he's been doing.
No, right. That's what he gets to do, right? That's like he's working within the scope of what he gets to do.
What he's doing. And he has been an extraordinary leader.
He has. I want to ask you one more thing. This is a little bit different, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. And it's challenging, right? Because we have these think tanks, and the Atlantic Council troubles me because it, in some ways, is the academic voice of a lot of the State Department people. They go back there and they speak, but they speak out in favor of different Arab Emirates, and the Arab Emirates oblige them or pre-oblige them with money, and they speak out internationally. They write about that. different Ukrainian businessmen, oligarchs, you can decide, they fund the Atlantic Council. And so they have this openly compromised relationship as they write these position pieces and academic pieces. And and again, when I look at our record the last 20 years, and I see the positions they take, and I see where the money comes from, I just don't sit comfortably with their advice. Look, I have a lot of people on this show that disagree with each other, and you all are very smart, right? And I don't mind dissent. But when it's funded by Pinchk and Shell International and all these different corporations, right? The Clinton Foundation,
for example, who's pushing very hard and doing all this stuff.
Right.
Recently wrote a long column from when he was in Ukraine at a conference funded by Pinchk.
Right.
Which he never mentions.
Yeah.
What the guy's position is. Incidentally, I won't just pick on the Atlantic Council. There are a lot of think tanks out there.
I'm picking on them, but you're right. It's very common to have these conflicts of interest, right?
I never should take foreign money.
Right.
And I know a lot who do, and they should never, never do it. The president of Brookings, who I won't name, had to leave because it was taking foreign money. And there are lots of others do. A lot of the Iranian opposition people take money that comes from other countries, which I could name, but I'm not going to name. And some of it may be U.S. quiet money as well. There are a lot of smart Americans out there who are not getting a voice. And I like to think I'm one of these smart Americans. I can name about 20 others who would say maybe even better what I just said. Same kind of thing. But we can show up on the Break It Down show.
Yes.
We won't be on Meet the Press. We won't be on Face the Nation. We won't be on the primary media. We won't be on the News Hour. The News Hour, which during the invasion of Iraq was hard over for the invasion. Okay? We were. Okay, fine. I don't know why they did it, but they did. They never said, I'm sorry. But there are people out there who can keep the debate going so that the average American who's interested will have sources of information. And most of what I'm contributing today is not Hunter having a line, but Hunter recommending a method to get engaged. And Pete, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm sure, with some people. You were what I call as an honest man. An honest man.
That's what I'm trying to be. Yeah. Yeah.
And there are a lot of honest people out there, but there are a lot who aren't. Or who think they are, but want to get jobs in government, want to get access to the media, want to get a place in a major think tank. And they know to get these things, they have to go with the flow, to go along in order to get along. Yeah. And people, unfortunately, who are the counter thinkers, right or wrong, are to a great extent excluded from the debate.
Right.
And so the average person watching television doesn't even get a chance to see what the alternative is. It's tragic. Yeah. And it's the most important factors weakening America in the world and weakening the quality of people we have in the American government, who we do not have right now the first team in charge of American foreign policy. We certainly didn't under Trump. We certainly didn't have George W. Bush. We did under G.H.W. Bush, part of for Clinton. But since then, and we did a little bit under Obama, but not recently. We don't, and that you can't afford not to have the first team. In private industry, if you didn't have the first team, you get fired because you wouldn't meet your target. You fire the CEO. We don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because it's troubling to me when I see that. I put a link down below for sort of this year, a CNBC piece that the head of the Atlantic Council wrote, and they had to put an editor's note and change the headline. Now, look, everybody already read the thing, But Fred from the Atlantic Council, who runs the thing, he's like, hey, all good with the with the Sultan Al Jabbar. He should definitely run the Environmental UN Council meeting this year in December, right? And then it got out. It's like, oh, those guys gave them $100 million, and so like they're like, oh crap, we have to now backtrack. Yes, this thing is published, and then they go, but the work had been done. And if a top guy says that, and again, like you said, all think tanks have to survive. They all need funds, to fund any chair, right? They have to have money to keep good people working, but you have to have good results. What's that?
The International Institute for Strategic Studies in London used to be the best in the world. They now got a large part of their money from a conference they run every year in Bahrain, funded by the Bahraini government.
Right.
Do you think the IISS is going to take any positions the Bahrainis don't like? Come on.
Yeah.
He pays the piper. And so many of them are like that. And the people, and I'm going to say another to get in trouble, a lot of the major foundations in America give the money to the usual suspects. They're not willing to run risks. Somebody out there might say something that goes against the consensus. I'd be in trouble. And almost all the major funding institutions, the big names, fail to do their job because they won't give the money to the people who in the old days, in the Cold War, who did the great thinking. The Ford Foundation and places like that funded the great thinking. The Air Force funded the Rand Corporation to do some great thinking. Nowadays, these people are too timid to. And as a result, the American people are getting cheated because we're getting foreign policies that too often don't meet American national interests.
There you go.
Ukraine's part of it. Full marks to Biden for keeping the war limited, but whether he has the people who are going to be able to figure out what we do in the future on Russia, I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly they're not doing a good job on China, and they've totally failed on Iran. I mean, right now we might have a war with Iran, which was turned off in 2015, turned on again by Trump, and kept turned on by Biden. Because we have a particular friend abroad who calls the shots on U.S. Middle East policy.
Yeah.
And every politician is afraid to say so because they'll get in trouble. Deep, deep trouble.
Well, you were not. You were candid. And if I'm a
political office, because I just ended my opportunity.
Well, you are an honest man as well. I appreciate you coming on the show and talking with me about that. And it's always interesting to hear you go back in time and talk about like the sequential progression of this thing, and I don't want to go too much longer up here, but like one of the things that Putin talked about several weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, he's like, you Americans have been in Russia in the last 100 years. And he's right. Like, the polar bears, 431, I've worked at that unit. They're part of their legacies. We were in Russia. We got stuck there and we stayed there after World War I.
1919,
that's right.
In Murmansk and in Vladivostok. When I was in the Carter White House, I had a lot of funny stuff to do. One of it was railroad retirement claims by American workers who were still alive who had worked on the Trans-Siberian Railroad in 1921. Okay, that is neither here nor there. The Russians have done more than their share of bad things, but you gotta understand your history. Incidentally, Putin makes up history.
Yeah,
he put out a 6,884 document which said that Ukraine never existed. It's always been part of Russia. I read it, and the first 90% of it, I'm confident Putin never read. It was written by some monk off in a monastery somewhere. He probably read the last 10%, which he used to justify. But the fact is, Russia has no legitimate claim over Ukraine.
That's right. That's right.
None. Crimea, okay, fine. But that was an accident. But in Ukraine proper, no claim whatsoever. And this war is a criminal war. Criminal war. But we have to find a way to stop it. We have to find a way to deal with Russia in the future. Maybe not 10 years, but 20 years to deal with them. Just as after the Treaty of Versailles in the 1930s, we had to deal with Hitler and revenge.
Yeah, we do not want to repeat that lesson.
H.W. Bush was brilliant, and Clinton, bipartisan basis, followed through. And there are people out there who are not recognized. Strobe Talbot, who was in charge of Russian affairs for Clinton, had it absolutely right. Most people don't even know what he said because he lost the battle later on.
Well, listen, I want to wrap it up so you can feed some more Christians to your dog, and you guys can have a good hangout. Thank you again for coming on. Anything in closing before we go?
People should give money to the Break It Down show if you need it. They should pay attention to it and read your history.
Yeah, read your history.
Listen to a lot of people. And remember, if you ever deal with another country, the first thing you have to know is its view of its history, its view of its culture, its view of its interests, because they matter.
That's true.
And if we don't get that right, we're going to be babes in the woods. That's how we got Vietnam. It's how we got Iraq. It's how we got Afghanistan. And it's how we're going to get the next problem we don't pay attention to.
Hey, thanks.